Welcome to Staffworks Explained. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. In this video, we are talking about Lamu Refinery, where we see that Kenya's $500 million bet and the bigger battle for East Africa's oil market. Kenya is being asked to put about $500 million, or roughly 64.7 billion Kenya shillings, into a refinery that could change the way East Africa produces, moves, and consumes petroleum products. The proposed Dangote refinery at Lamu would be capable of processing up to 700,000 barrels of crude oil a day, which is a scale comparable to Dangote's flagship refinery in Lekki, Lagos, Nigeria, and significantly larger than the region's present refined fuel requirements. But the headline figure is only part of the story. This is simply a question of whether Kenya should buy 10% of the refinery. It is a question of whether East Africa can coordinate crude supply, infrastructure, financing, and markets well enough to make a project of this size commercially viable. It is also a test of whether governments have learned from the long-running experience of Uganda's refinery, where regional governments were invited to take up equity, but several ultimately stayed away, leaving Uganda to carry larger share of the project. That history matters because Lamu proposal is emerging at a time when East Africa is developing several competing energy corridors, from Lamu to Tanga, as well as Hoima. The projects are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they will compete for crude, capital, customers, as well as strategic influence. Let's start by looking at this $500 million question. Dangote Group has offered East Africa governments a combined 30% equity stake, reportedly worth about $1.5 billion. Kenya has been offered 10% for approximately $500 million, while Ethiopia, Rwanda have also expressed interest in participating in this regional regional allocation of 30%. Kenya's proposed contribution would reportedly be financed through local bonds rather than the earlier idea of National Infrastructure Fund. In practical terms, that means the government would borrow from the domestic financial system, potentially drawing capital from pension funds, insurance companies, banks, as well as other institutional investors. That distinction is important. An equity investment is not the same as buying fuel in advance. Kenya would be purchasing an ownership interest and therefore taking part in projects' commercial risks and potential returns. If the refinery performs well, the state would benefit through dividends and an increase in the value of its investment. If construction costs rise, the refinery operates below capacity, the crude supply becomes unreliable, or regional demand fails to materialize, the investment could underperform. There's also the second issue. Kenya has indicated that it could buy larger stakes if other regional countries do not take up the shares offered to them. That may be strategically attractive, but it would also increase Kenya's financial exposure. The key questions for Nairobi, therefore, is not simply whether Kenya can raise $500 million. It is what exactly is Kenya buying for $500 million, and at what commercial terms, and what obligations come with it. Those details will matter more than the headline percentage. A project approaching 20 billion, let's look at that. The refinery itself, as currently being discussed, it costs roughly $16 billion US, while the wider developments, including petrochemical facilities, addition of port infrastructure, could take overall investment to around $20 billion US. Construction is targeted to begin in September 2026 and could approximately take 3 years or to 5 years at most. The financial model is expected to rely heavily on debt. A 70 by 30 debt to equity structure would mean that on a 16 billion project, approximately 11.2 billion would have to be borrowed and 4.8 billion US dollars supplied as equity. If the wider investment reaches 20 billion, those figures rise to about 14 billion US dollars of debt and 6 billion of equity. $6 billion of equity. Dangote would retain the majority position with 70% of equity, while the regional governments and other investors would share the remaining 30%. That structure makes sense from control perspective. Dangote remains the dominant shareholder, while regional governments have enough ownership to give them a meaningful economic interest. But it also exposes one of the project's biggest challenges. A project requiring more than $10 billion in equity in debt cannot rely on political enthusiasm. Banks and other lenders will want to see firm crude supply agreements, credible buyers for refineries product, reliable infrastructure, predictable regulations, and financial model capable of repaying the loans. In project finance language, the lenders need to know what the project itself can generate would like to know that the project itself can generate enough dependable cash to service its debt. Political backing helps, but it does not substitute that that test. Another question is why Lamu? Lamu is not an accidental choice. The location gives the project access to deep water port and places the refinery on Indian Ocean, creating the possibility of receiving large crude tankers and distributing refined products inland and across the region. The proposed refinery would be designed around crude from East Africa producers and would serve markets extending beyond Kenya. That creates the central commercial proposition, turning East Africa crude into refined products close to the markets that consume them. The refinery is expected to process crude associated with producers in countries including Kenya, Uganda, and South Sudan. Preliminary figures cited in the proposal have suggested roughly 350,000 barrels per day from South Sudan, 250 barrels per day from Uganda, although these should be treated as project assumption rather than guaranteed supply. And that distinction is critical. A refinery can be built on the schedule and still fail commercially if it does not receive enough suitable crude at competitive prices. The same applies to on the other side. Producing fuel is not enough if the refinery cannot secure long-term buyers. Let's now look at the Uganda lesson. East Africa has been here before. Uganda originally promoted its planned Hoima refinery as an East African community project, offering regional governments an opportunity to take equity. Initial structure allocated 40% of the refinery to the East African community governments, with the remainder intended for private investors. The response was mixed. Kenya committed to a 2.5% stake, while Tanzania eventually committed to about 8%. Rwanda and Burundi did not take up the opportunity, and so is South Sudan. Uganda's government subsequently had to assume a larger share of the government allocation. The reasons were revealing. Potential investors wanted greater certainty about project cost, engineering structure, and commercial viability. At one stage, the project did not even have a sufficiently developed engineering, procurement, and construction structure. That is the contract framework that tells the investors who will design, build, and deliver the facility and for how much, as well as under what condition. Investors also had to contend with repeated delays, changes in the proposed development structure, among other things. The lack of clear construction and financing framework made the project difficult to treat as a bankable investment, meaning a project capable of satisfying lenders that their money could be repaid. Uganda eventually moved away from the original broad regional ownership model. The refinery is now being advanced through a partnership including Uganda government, the UAE-based Alpha MBM investment, with a reported 60 by 40 ownership structure. President Yoweri Museveni has nevertheless continued to support the refinery as part of Uganda's strategy to add value to its crude before export. The lesson for Lamu is straightforward. Offering equity does not automatically create investors. Governments may support a regional project in principle, but still decline to commit money if the numbers, construction arrangements, financing plan, or expected returns are not sufficiently clear. Uganda's experience is particularly relevant to Kenya's because it demonstrates what happens when regional participation is treated as a political objective before underlying commercial arrangements are fully settled. And now, Uganda has another choice, as we know. There is an additional complication that did not exist in quite the same form when Uganda's original refinery model was being negotiated. Uganda is now part of a separate energy development strategy on Tanzania Tanga port. In August 2026, Uganda, Tanzania, and Vital Bahrain signed an agreement to develop what has been described as a 20 billion US dollars integrated energy hub at Tanga, involving refining, storage, marine infrastructure, logistics, and petroleum distribution. The project is intended to connect with the East African crude oil pipeline and strengthen Tanga's role as a regional energy gateway. That creates a strategic choice for Uganda. The country could potentially supply crude into more than one regional value chain, but it cannot ignore economics. If its crude is committed to one refinery or energy corridor, which is under long-term agreements, that affects the availability of feedstock for competing projects. This is where Lamu project becomes more than a Kenyan investment. It becomes part of a wider context where East Africa oil will be refined, stored, and transported as well as sold. Earlier this year, East African governments were already discussing possible joint refinery at Tanga, involving crude from Uganda, South Sudan, Kenya, and Democratic Republic of Congo. Dangote also indicated that he was prepared to lead a regional refinery project if governments agreed on that structure. The subsequent emergence of Lamu proposal means that the region now has several major energy ambitions developing at the same time that could encourage healthy competition. It could also produce duplication if governments commit to projects without first determining which infrastructure the region actually needs. The market is large, we say, but it's not limited. The proposed 700,000 barrels per day Lamu Refinery is huge. One industry assessment has put current East African refined fuel demand at around 450,000 barrels per day, meaning Lamu's proposed capacity would exceed present regional demand by a substantial margin, around 250,000 barrels per day. That is not necessarily a weakness. A refinery can export surplus production, but it changes the commercial calculations. Lamu would need to compete not only with East African projects but with the established international suppliers. Its advantage would have to come from transport economics, reliable crude supply, product quality, scale, and proximity to customers. The refinery scale may also be deliberately designed for a larger market than East Africa alone. That would make Lamu an export-oriented facility rather than simply a plant intended to replace Kenya's current fuel imports. This is where the port becomes part of the business case. The refinery, storage facilities, pipelines, marine infrastructure have to work as one system. Building the processing plants without adequate distribution infrastructure would leave a very expensive asset underutilized. Let's now look at Dangote's own financing strategy. Dangote is not relying solely on government shareholders. The group intends to support its investment from its corporate resources while also pursuing a much broader capital market strategy. Dangote Petroleum Refinery has been preparing for a potential $5 billion initial public offer IPO, which could become one of the East Africa or Africa's large ever listing. Reuters reported that the refinery has applied for an IPO of up to $5 billion and that the transaction is expected to focus initially on Nigeria, with the discussions around broader East Africa investor in participation. That matters to Lamu because Dangote is effectively building a capital raising platform around its refinery business. At the same time, is seeking regional partners for Kenya project. There's also a caution here. Public listing can bring substantial capital, but it does not eliminate project risk. Investors will still assess the refinery's profitability, expansion plans, crude supply arrangements, debt levels, as well as the economics of future projects. The real test for Kenya. Kenya proposed 64.7 billion investment should therefore be evaluated against a much larger project management questions. Are the conditions for successful delivery actually in place? Before committing the full amount, the government would need clarity on several issues. First, there must be a credible construction contract and schedule. A September 2026 groundbreaking announcement is useful, but investors need to know what has already been contracted, what remains to be financed, and what could delay completion. Second, the crude supply chain must be firm. It is not enough to say Uganda, South Sudan could supply crude. There must be commercially enforceable arrangements covering volumes, quality, and pricing, as well as transportation. Third, Kenya needs to understand its physical or financial exposure. If the project requires additional equity because other regional partners decline their allocation, Nairobi should know in advance how much it would be expected to contribute. Fourth, the government should distinguish between strategic value and financial return. A refinery can be strategically important without necessarily being the highest return investment available to the state. And finally, the project must be integrated with the Kenya's existing port, pipeline, as well as petroleum infrastructure rather than develop a standalone facility. A question, what could happen next? And we say there are several plausible outcomes. The first is the most ambitious. Kenya, Ethiopia, and Rwanda to take up their proposed stakes. Other regional governments participate. Dangote retains majority control and the project reaches financial close before construction begins. The second is more Kenya-heavy structure. If other governments decline, Kenya could increase its participation. As officials have suggested, that would give Nairobi more influence but would also concentrate more financial risk in the Kenya's public balance sheet. The third possibility is that regional governments remain cautious, forcing Dangote and other investors to rely more heavily on private capital and debt. Uganda's earlier experience shows that this can happen even when governments publicly support a project. And there's a fourth possibility that deserves serious attention. East Africa could end up with several large energy projects competing with one another rather than operating as a coordinated network. Hoima, Tanga, as well as Lamu each have a strategic rationale, but their success will depend on how crude moves through the region, where refined products are sold, which ports handle the trade, and how much financing the market can absorb. There's also the decision which is bigger than the 10%. Kenya's proposed $500 million investment should not be judged simply by whether Kenya sharing 64.7 billion is large or small amount of money. It is large enough to matter, but small enough relative to overall project that Kenya cannot control the outcome by itself. The bigger issue is whether Kenya can secure a commercially sound position in a project that could make Lamu major energy hub for the region. Uganda's refinery experience provides an important warning. Regional ownership sounds attractive, but governments do not necessarily invest simply because a project is labeled regional. They invest when the numbers, contracts, risks, and strategic benefits make sense. Uganda's earlier offer to its neighbors produced partial participation as well as uncertainty over the project structure and financing contributing to the reluctance. Lamu therefore has an opportunity to do things differently. If Dangote can bring the financing together, secure reliable crude, look in regional customers, and build the supporting infrastructure alongside the refinery, Kenya could acquire a stake in one of the most consequential industrial projects ever proposed for the East African coast. But if the region repeats its old patterns, announcing large projects first and resolving financing, supply commitments, and commercial coordination later, the size of the refinery could become its greatest weakness. The most important decision now is not whether East Africa wants a refinery. It clearly does. The real decision is which refinery model the region can actually finance, supply, operate, and sustain for decades. For Kenya, the $500 million stake is therefore not merely an investment in a plant at Lamu. It is a bet on where East Africa energy economy will be anchored, and whether this time the region can turn a shared ambition into a commercially disciplined project. So thank you if you came this far. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can also watch other videos that we have made on this refinery and other projects within Kenya, East Africa, and Africa at large. So thank you, and let's meet in the next one.